Alright, yo. I'm gonna try to do a video while I'm driving again. Just because I feel like I haven't seen a lot of people talking about this idea or this situation. And to be honest with you, I didn't know it was a situation or what was ongoing until like maybe 3 days ago. And I found out about a day after it had happened. Oh, traffic being weird, sorry, y'all. Alright, so there's a class action lawsuit. It's been approved as a class action lawsuit against the UFC. But the lawsuit itself has been going on for 10 years. I need to go do my due diligence, and I don't have it on me right now, on what fighters started the lawsuit. But, so to first make it make sense, the difference in what makes it a class action is now, say there were like 5 fighters that got together and they wanted to sue the UFC for illegal contracts, like their contracts doing something illegal. Well, if they make it class action and it gets approved, then if these contracts existed for like 2 years, everyone who was involved in those contracts is now involved in the lawsuit. So all these other fighters that were possibly subjected to an unfair contract are now brought into the lawsuit as plaintiffs, and they don't have to do anything unless they choose to opt out. So this lawsuit went from a handful of people to overnight it's now 1,200 people, and it's a federal thing. And from what I understood, it's an antitrust. And to get it that far with antitrust is a pretty big deal. Antitrust has to do with having fair competition in the competitive environment. So like I was just talking to a friend today, and when I learned about antitrust, it was really just something, I don't know, it's just fascinating because it's not quite perfect. It's kind of intangible. But an example of an antitrust lawsuit that I know of when I was learning it in college is like this in a break room at like a coal plant. It's so far back in time they have a salt machine. Like you put in a nickel or a penny and you can get some salt. And, or I guess they might have just dispensed it for free for your employees, you know what I mean? But it's within this machine. The machine lets you know that you can only use their brand of salts or else it voids the warranty and this and that. Literally at my employment right now, I have to wash my hands in this contraption that also says they have to use this type of soap. That's an antitrust violation on the salt because their brand of salt did not offer anything different or a competitive edge over another brand of salt. Say their brand of salt was a little different, so it dispensed different and it had to be used to fit through tubes in that machine. Well, then you could do that in a way, but it's not. They're just kind of taking advantage of the market. Really, Windows should have been an antitrust, and it might have been like how when the computers started coming out in 98, 90s, whatever it was, everyone had Windows on it. Like as soon as we get it, so all we know is Windows, like Linux or whoever, they didn't even have a chance to compete. All right, so the UFC is getting an antitrust lawsuit about their contracts, and it's basically being alleged that they bought up all the talent so that competitors, we'll say a competitor, something like Bellator, One, you guys get what I mean, Cage Fury, things like that. Some of these have become feeders, but if the UFC gives all these contracts out and then locks everyone in where you can't get the contract out, no one else can sign any talent to compete. Now, it's kind of like if you sign a contract, you sign a contract. It is what it is, but there's actually some unfair shit going on. And without all this lawsuit, I can tell you I see the unfairness in part of this. And two great examples off the top of my head, Miesha Tate and Nick Diaz. Nick Diaz has got however many fights left in his fucking contract from 10 goddamn years ago. We had to watch Nick Diaz get in there 10 years out of his prime and try to fight Robbie Lawler a couple months ago. He did all right. He did okay. Like, I think Nick's expectation of himself is why he took the knee and decided to call the fight. Miesha Tate went and had a baby And now they won't let her go exhibition box to make some money unless she honors all the fights in her contract. When you're in these contracts with the UFC, you can't go do this celebrity boxing. You can't go do exhibitions. You can't do anything of any performance in combat relation unless it's with the UFC or approved by them. So think about that. Your career is literally in that craft, and you can only do your craft with that company for the rest of your life because you had a life-altering event that caused you to step away. And it could also mean your talent is no longer at the level that you can compete with. For example, Nate Diaz cannot compete with Chimaev. Look what they tried to do to Nate Diaz in his last fight. They tried to throw him in with Chimaev, get the ever-living tar beat out of him, tarnish Nate Diaz's name so it doesn't have the value in an exhibition fight against Jake Paul. Luckily, things worked out. Tony met up with Nate and everything like that. But that's a very, very clear as day what they're doing. Miesha Tate has how many more fights after she's had a baby and didn't want anything to do with this? This is a bunch of crap. And it's tricky because, like, the UFC is such a savior for a lot of us. You know, if it wasn't for the UFC, I wouldn't be making this video. There wouldn't be a fight game to talk about. So it's like, how bad do we talk about Dana? We can't blame Dana for all the contracts. There's multiple people involved in this. But how bad do we talk about someone who built something? And what the real issue is adjustments have to be made. Early on, Dana absolutely had to put the money into marketing, like he talked about, and he's explained that. But that was 25 years ago, you know? Like, things have changed now, and they've made adjustments, but there isn't a person alive that can tell me that these fighters are getting paid what they should. Because we only hear of the top performers' pay. Man, just last year I was looking at fights and people are getting $3,000 a fight. $3,000 a fight. And look at what just happened to Wonder Boy. And Dana's wording it like Wonder Boy didn't want the fight. For those who don't know, Wonder Boy had a fight booked for the pay-per-view. They go to the weigh-ins. I believe they're going to fight at 170. The guy weighs like 176 or something. He doesn't make weight. Dana ends up at the press conference, and Wonder Boy's come out and said he still hasn't been paid, and he feels like he should be paid by the UFC, and it's kind of an ordeal. And Wonder Boy is the nicest, most politically correct fighter in the UFC, and I don't think anyone's going to debate that. Dana, when finally asked about it, which is like 3 weeks after the event, so Wonder Boy's still not paid, is like, look, Wonder Boy didn't want to fight. He was offered the fight. He was offered 20% of his opponent's purse to take the fight. He didn't take it. Wonder Boy addressed all that up front. He was like, look, I could take part of his purse, but this guy didn't have to dehydrate himself to the extent that I did and put his body in the condition that I'm in. I'm a veteran, and I'm on my last run to make a shot at a title. It's not worth it for me to risk this fight. I want the right fight and everything. But Dana's going to go out there and say Wonder Boy didn't want to fight. His opponent didn't want to fight because his opponent couldn't meet the guidelines of the fight. And the way Dana's done that, or the UFC's done that to people over and over again, is BS. That is bullshit. But anyways, so this class action lawsuit has to do with the competitive environment, maintaining a competitive environment. It's not just... They have some things tied in with pay. There's a couple things tied into the lawsuit. It mentions how other entities are paid 50% of the revenue to the athletes, where UFC is paying less than 20%. I don't know how the revenue part's going to go. That's a tricky thing. But the antitrust with the contracts, that can actually stick, in my opinion. When I first started learning how people were tied up in those contracts, I was like, this is completely fucked up. But I haven't seen a lot of information about this. The only thing I actually saw was like 3 or 4 days ago. It was on Ariel Helwani. He got to talking about it, and he played the clip of the lawyer that's in charge of the lawsuit. He's put out clips explaining what it is in very simple terms where people like you and I can understand. And all I'm really doing is relaying the highlights of it. There were also some potential rule changes, which I'll briefly mention while we got time. They're talking about, with an eye poke, instead of like immediately asking the guy if he can see, and then immediately having a doctor come in and immediately having a doctor shine a flashlight in, Let the fighter, and he used the words like enjoy his 5 minutes, but give him a tool to recover. As in, they're talking about being able to give the fighter an ice pack and a towel, if I remember correctly, to where for 60 to 90 seconds they can apply it to their eye. Then remove it, give the fighter a little bit, another 30 seconds, kind of get their wits about them. Then ask if they can see. Like, actually give them the time to recover instead of putting pressure on them from the start to recover. Because, like, immediately if you walk up, think about if you're a fighter. If you get walked up by the doctor and he's like, can you see, right after you get poked, and you say no, that doctor can literally end the fight right then. So it's a tricky situation, and I appreciate that they're trying to find solutions for that. There was another part of that. Another part was tied into a cut, and it had to do with the cut man and I guess being able to stop the bleeding or something. I don't really remember the details on that one. It didn't seem a lot different to me, but I could be mistaken. But anyways, the big thing is this class action lawsuit against the UFC for antitrust. Antitrust is really hard to stick, but the fact that they got it approved and it's actually happening, that's a big, big step. So I don't know what the UFC would do, knowing how all this works and things take forever in court. I'd imagine the UFC is just about to make adjustments to their contracts and change it up to where they ain't got to deal with anything going forward. But I do remember when the money with the 1,200, now that it's a class action lawsuit and it involves 1,200 fighters, and they were talking about pay not being right, which could have also been someone missing weight. It was saying estimated that the UFC owed these fighters between $800 million and $1.2 billion. That's a lot of damn money. So if UFC loses this lawsuit within like a year and they have to pay that out, it's going to be interesting what's going to happen. I don't think it stops anything, but just two things that if they can get through it, which they probably will, then they're probably going to recover fully because they already have all the top talent and everything. So in a way, it might seem like this lawsuit is a way to take a jab at the UFC. This lawsuit might actually be what the UFC needed to get back on track to continue to be the most dominant mixed martial arts company. I'm almost home now, so I'm going to go ahead and call it a video. But that was Concepts with Kimbler. I don't know who is right away. That was Concepts with Kimbler. And, yeah, antitrust lawsuit against the UFC.